Welcome, this is your 5-minute geography lesson. We're covering theme 3, element 7, seismic impacts. Hands up for answers. I'm Mr. S and I'll be your 5-minute teacher. Seismic events relate to earthquakes and other vibrations of the earth and its crust. Impacts, can also be called effects, are split into primary and secondary. And we're going to start with the primary. Now some of these we've discussed in relation to volcanic impacts and effects, so some of them are similar, but we're going to look at them in terms of how does earthquakes specifically affect the population and the land around it. We need to discuss what we're classifying as a primary effect, but I'm going to leave it to the end. We're going to discuss what we've got here in front of us to start with. So socially, we've got a shaking of the ground can result in buildings and infrastructure to collapse. So that could cause death and injury, but we're going to lose homes and we're going to split up families. This is all social. That collapsing infrastructure can also mean that buildings like hospitals, which is also a social impact, can affect the health. Other buildings like businesses, it could be roads, it could be pipe networks, are all going to suffer as well from these collapses in infrastructure. This can have an economic effect because of the monetary value that is associated with these. What cost will it be to rebuild that highway, to reinstall the pipe networks? But also it limits the ability for the businesses to get back up and doing what they normally do. So shops can't open until there's a road network, until they've got electricity supply, that the area is safe, and then we've got sanitation and people are actually able to shop because they've got a home to go to, because shopping's not their most important need when they're living in a temporary shelter. That collapsed infrastructure is also going to disrupt the travel and evacuation of people in the immediate term. And then in the longer term, this can still have an impact. If we can't get to locations, it's going to reduce the recovery time of the area as well, which is both economic and social. And then that shaking of the ground can disrupt habitats. We looked at last lesson how landslides occur and liquefaction. These are all changing the nature of what that environment once looked like. Now I said we needed to discuss something about primary effects. There is a debate about whether primary effects are all of these things that I've got on the table, or whether there's only one primary effect of an earthquake. And some people would argue that actually the only primary effect of an earthquake is this here, the shaking of the ground. And we're not including the buildings and the infrastructure collapse here. We're purely looking at the fact that the ground will shake. Some people would argue that that is the only primary effect. And the reason they say that is that's exactly what the earthquake's doing. It's shaking the ground. And everything that happens afterwards is technically a secondary impact. And the way people talk about this is if you were in a field in the middle of nowhere, there was no buildings whatsoever, there was no fences, it was just a flat field, and an earthquake happened there, would you die or would you be injured? No, you wouldn't, because the shaking of the ground is not going to do anything to you really. It might shock you a bit, you might fall over if it was really bad, but the likelihood of you actually being even injured by that is almost non-existent. So what actually kills people are the buildings falling, the pipes bursting and causing fires. And we would argue that actually these are all secondary effects because the only primary thing happening is the shaking of the land, and everything that happens afterwards is a secondary. So if you were arguing for whether primary effects or secondary effects were worse, you might actually include this definition and say, well, actually the secondary are worse because everything other than the ground shaking is classed as secondary. So let's actually have a look at what the secondary effects are, or more of them, depending on what your viewpoint is. Well, after the earthquake has happened, the land is starting to settle into its new resting position, the two plates, and in the process, that's going to cause some smaller earthquakes, which are called aftershocks. Although they're smaller, they can still damage and they can still cause harm, particularly when we think about the fact that it's already went through a big earthquake, this area, and it's probably not ready for any more earthquakes and how to respond to them. So again, that can be social, it could also be economic. There's a lack of toilets and clean water, particularly in areas that have been devastated by a collapse in infrastructure from lack of piping and clean water and sewage networks, but also Homes have been destroyed, so people will be living in temporary shelters and accommodation which won't have plumbed sanitary and water. That can then lead to health issues, as it means that we're going to have more likely incidents of spreading diseases of contaminated water like cholera and dysentery. And with the collapse of infrastructure, it's going to restrict access to food and travel, meaning travel prices and food prices increase, but we've also got a lack of access to medical care as well, which is going to link to the social as well. And on a longer term scale, there's going to be a lack of profit or a reduction in profit from businesses, as they can't reopen until the relief effort is started and buildings have been rebuilt. So it's going to impact on the economy. And then burst gas lines. So when those pipes split, it causes fires which can destroy land, but equally it can devastate housing, it can devastate lives. These secondary impacts, such as these fires, can cause as many deaths and injuries as the initial phase of the earthquake. Well, that brings our lesson to an end, but continue at your own pace by completing the now try tasks for homework. Class dismissed.